strike and strike and strike and strike and strike and strike until you have victory. For every enemy that is aligned against you, let there be that we would strike the ground, for you will give us victory, God. I hear a sound of abundant rain. I hear the sound of victory. I hear the sound of shouting and singing. I hear the sound of victory and strike 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 and strike. The angels have even dispatched from Africa right now. Africa right now. Africa right now. From Africa right now.
Greetings, friends. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, special bird singing in the background edition. Trying to record during the day. We'll see how that goes. Find the bibliography for this episode at againsttheinternet.com. It took me forever to get the last bibliography up, but I had exceptionally good reasons for that. I'm in Portland now. I wasn't when I made that episode. So I simultaneously had to move into a space that I built a while ago. It was like largely finished, but still definitely a construction site. And then simultaneously to start administering dialysis to myself in said space for the first time. And so a maelstrom of logistics, naturally. So got a little bit behind, but I thought it would be worth, just mentioning a little bit. So I'm back in, I'm at a house that if I had to guess, and I certainly do have to guess, I would guess that I've lived here like 15, 20 really distinct times. And this house used to be called, still is called by some people, Doom School. And we used to have classes here. And a couple of years ago, during one of the innumerable times that I was living here, when I first was starting to think about presenting the material that comprises this podcast to the world at large, I wanted to reinitiate that tradition. So I was living in a little space in the living room, surrounded by like a little nook with a curtain, surrounded by like all the walls were covered in giant pieces of poster paper with all my like crazy notes and arrows pointing to boxes of text, pointing to other boxes of text kind of thing. I felt good and mad scientist on an aesthetic level. I built this space in the backyard in 2019, and so now I'm back here and it all feels, we called it Doom School because we were like, well, we can teach people how to live when society collapses or whatever. And it feels really aesthetically on point. Like I feel like I'm really inhabiting the full scope of my mandate, basically, to be, like in this little shack in this place called Doom School that was so named in order to teach people about the apocalypse, like with a machine, like hooked up to a machine that's necessary for my survival. I don't know. I think it's all quite lovely and perfect. And I think that I really am just like sensing a growing desire for this kind of analysis. The recent election sort of amplified that a little bit. I think that, there's a variety of responses. There was, of course, like the liberal euphoria. There were people like me who had quips like, well, I used to always be terrified of people loving me because then I would have to wait for them to reject me. But now that Joe Biden is president, I don't feel that way anymore or whatever. Like, huge range of perceptions, but I think that one of the most common ones for a lot of people, like leftists and liberals alike, was just this utter bewilderment that as many people voted for Trump as did, and that people support him as fervently as they do. And, this real desire for explanations of why the fuck that is. A sense that, like, well, this guy like killed people's grandmothers and wives and husbands with his response to the pandemic and has impoverished people or whatever, like the sense that it just doesn't have any real rational foundation and a real sense of bewilderment about why that is. And so I think that There's a growing amenability to looking at innate factors and how those also shape political perspective, in addition to all of the structural analysis and whatnot that comprises almost all political thinking. And so with that assumption in mind, friends, with operating on the premise that this analysis is something that people are kind of looking for and that can help people structure their perceptions and their political activity in potentially useful ways, I made a Patreon. So if you want to support me and this podcast, find me at patreon.com/biological singularity. You know, like the technological singularity, only better. And I don't want to ramble too much about money. I think that I classically fall into I'm like the guy who gives up his life to go around organizing, and then when somebody gives him gas money to drive hundreds of miles to help some people blockade something, feels like guilty about taking the gas money and is like, should this really be mine? Does somebody else need this more or whatever? And I don't want to indulge that tendency too fucking much, but you know, just to say a few words, it's hard because the world is hurting so badly, and the scarcity that the people with everything create means that there's just really not enough for the rest of us. And so there are so many people who so desperately need money. And I'm at least really fortunate. I'm really broke, but I am exceptionally fortunate in that I have a real solid network of people who are willing to have me around and help me out in various ways. And that's a huge form of wealth. I mean, that's material wealth, right? I'm in a space that's my own right now. But I guess the appeals that I would make are like, if there's a criterion that I meet that I think is a compelling reason to give me money beyond, simply liking the podcast, it would be that there was, a series of decisions that I made with totally open eyes, with a complete comprehension of the very likely consequences, to engage in political processes to the maximum extent possible, which meant really just sacrificing many other elements of life. And those decisions have had the dire consequences that I knew that they might, but I just don't have as much of like a solid foundation of material stability as I really could have if I hadn't made those decisions. And I do think that people who choose to fight at the expense of comfort, that's a category of people that I think deserve support if people have the means. So there's my perhaps unnecessarily moralistic and earnest appeal for some dollars if you happen to have them to spare. And with that, I guess we will say that this perhaps overly long introduction has come to an end.
Each October on the island of Phuket, just off the western coast of the Thai Peninsula, a religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts.
Dozens of medieval authors recount the terrible compulsion to dance that, in 1374, swept across western Germany, the Low Countries, and northeastern France. Chronicles agree that thousands of people danced in agony for days or weeks, screaming of terrible visions and imploring priests and monks to save their souls. A few decades later, the abbot of a monastery near the city of Trier recalled an amazing epidemic in which a collection of hallucinating dancers hopped and leapt for as long as 6 months, some of them dying after breaking ribs or loins. On a far larger scale was the outbreak that struck the city of Strasbourg in 1518, consuming as many as 400 people. One chronicle states that it claimed, for a brief period at least, about 15 lives a day, as men, women and children danced in the punishing summer heat. This is a description from the medical journal The Lancet about a phenomenon variously described as dancing mania, a dancing epidemic, dancing hysteria, or even dancing plague. And this is one of those things where, like, I am openly aesthetically enamored with a lot of the material that we are going to cover today. I think that it's just sort of exceptionally thrilling. It appeals to the same part of my psyche that likes heavy metal, right? So, you know, I'm not going to try to hide that because it's just going to come out. I think phrases like dancing plague are badass, right? So this really happened, like the Lancet says. The dozens and dozens of authors provide accounts of this. There's converging evidence. There's a bunch of very like prosaic forms of evidence in the form of like municipal records of how officials tried to deal with this phenomenon. It utterly disrupted normal social relations and the like routine functioning of societies in which it occurred. It was apparently truly spontaneous as far as anybody can discern in a huge number of cases. There was a very clear element of contagion. People would witness a group of people dancing in a sort of like ecstatic frenzy. The actual like modes of expression, the behaviors themselves did vary from time to time, place to place, but there seemed to be like common themes of like a hyper agitated state, usually some belief in some kind of supernatural or at least external agent that induced this behavior, and people would just spontaneously join. And so, you know, like instead of going to work or church or whatever it was that people were doing, they just kind of gave up on their lives and started roaming around, dancing frantically, in many cases dancing to the death. It was also very common for them to deviate from social conventions in important ways, to whatever, like engage in ritual obscenities or, you know, like scream obscenities, forbidden gestures, things like that. So it was like a true like massive rupture from the social order. And this is going to be one of those journeys where we see a lot of really fuzzy boundaries between different phenomena. We see phenomena described in different disciplines or just in different journal articles or whatever as separate, where it's actually like very, very difficult to discern like where one really begins and the other ends. And that's usually a powerful indication that the fundamental, like the frames of reference that academic analysis is choosing have something kind of wrong with them, that there's something kind of missing. This relates to, if you recall, in the Nature, Nurture, Death Spiral series, I talked about how the very divisions of social sciences don't really reflect clearly, like logically explicit boundaries, but more just kind of like these different, almost like stylistic approaches, and how that indicates that there's something horribly, you know, something desperately needed that's missing. That thing is biology and an understanding of the innate aspects of behavior. But yeah, so that's the dancing epidemics per se, and they happened from, I think it was the 11th century up through the 16th, 17th. But then a very clearly, strongly related phenomenon, same kind of like general cultural area, same kind of general time, is tarantism. And, you know, you should always pay particular attention when behaviors are very similar or identical, but the cited reasons for them are widely disparate. So in the case of dancing epidemics, a panoply of different sort of like supernatural causes and possession and whatnot were typically cited as the reasons, if any reason was cited. Oh, and I should mention, You may have heard something about this phenomenon, and you may have heard the hypothesis that it was caused by ergot poisoning. And this is one of those things, like, this is just one of those conventions that, it's like an explanation that, to the extent that there's popular knowledge of the dancing epidemics, sort of like gains this like popular dissemination and popular appeal that just doesn't really have much of a basis at all. So every paper I read about this, had the same kind of like, they essentially all said some variation on, well, we know what ergot poisoning does, and it doesn't make people dance for 6 months to the death. That's just not, it's not a plausible hypothesis. It doesn't account for the very specific, maybe some of those people were experiencing ergot poisoning, but something else was certainly happening. Okay, so tarantism. Quoting from a paper critiquing purely psychological explanations of this, explanations rooted in a broader phenomenon that we'll get to called mass psychogenic illness, which again, fuzzy boundaries, lots of like crises of classification, like where does one phenomenon start and the next end. One of the earliest cited examples of seemingly bizarre behavior to be labeled as exemplifying mass psychogenic illness and group mental illness is what Gloin terms the mass hysterical reaction to perceived bites of the tarantula spider during the Middle Ages in southern Italy. The first recorded descriptions of the contagious mental disease, classified by physicians as tarantism, appeared during the 13th century and persisted on a widespread scale in southern Europe for 400 years, reaching its height in the 17th century. Tarantism was reported almost exclusively during the height of the hot, dry summer months of July and August. And then he quotes from another author, "People, asleep or awake, would suddenly jump up, feeling an acute pain like the sting of a bee. Some saw the spider, others did not, but they knew that it must be the tarantula. They ran out of the house into the street, to the marketplace, dancing in great excitement. Soon they were joined by others who, like them, had just been bitten, or by people who had been stung in previous years, for the disease was never quite cured. The poison remained in the body and was reactivated every year by the heat of summer. Music and dancing were the only effective remedies, and people were known to have died within an hour or in a few days because music was not available." So if you've ever heard of the musical form, the tarantella, that's where this term comes from, and it's it's like a fast-paced tune with a bunch of like brief repetitive phrases. The kind of thing you would want to dance manically for days on end to if you'd been bitten by a magical spider. It probably won't come as too much of a surprise that there's no, tarantula bites are pretty harmless to humans, and there's no like unique subspecies of tarantula endemic to Italy that makes people dance manically for days on end. There's no tarantula that causes these symptoms, quoting again from this paper. "During dances, many immodestly tore off their clothing and pranced naked through the streets. Some screamed and beckoned to be tossed into the air, while others danced furiously, in what some observers described as strange, colorful attire. A few reportedly laughed or wept to the point of death. Women howled and made obscene gestures. Some participants rolled themselves in the dirt, while others relished being struck on the soles of their feet." And he also says that there's a clear relationship between ritual madness in ancient Greece and tarantism. And so he also talks about the relationship between the manifestations of tarantism and behaviors associated with contemporary or more recently historical ecstatic religious movements. And he talks about how in those cases, the forms of like ecstatic, possessed, frenzy, whatever you want to call it, they are very like heavily institutionalized and ritualized. They are familiar forms to all participants in those religious phenomena. And he goes ahead and lists some of the names of religious persuasions that are so called because of behaviors that they exhibit that are similar to aspects of Tarantism. The Shakers, Quakers, Jumpers, Leapers, Barkers, and Rollers. I like that. And he talks about how, while they were very frequently described as like engaging in uncontrollable behavior, we can see, and that is like the core premise, but both by external observers and by the participants themselves. We can definitely see some distinct patterns. And so there's a clear sort of continuity between this behavior and a whole vast array of, like possession states, ecstatic states, trance states that are known from around the world, where people like lose control and are, where some wild spirit enters them and they behave in a frenzied manner and completely deviate from social protocols and all that good stuff, but and uncontrollability and wildness and frenzy are like core themes, but at the same time, like we can see culturally patterned ways that this like general human tendency will manifest. It never manifests just as like there's no pure version of it. It's always heavily culturally mediated.
If I told you to crawl on your belly in the street, would you do that? Yes, Father! If I told you you can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't stop running for God, would you do that? Yes, Father! Then you all must be bonkers. Yes, Father! Bonkers for God!
But so about all those ancient Greek rituals, I think that the most kind of like exciting, cool descriptions of religious frenzy that I've encountered probably do relate to Dionysus and that cult. Although descriptions of like Odinic frenzy, like berserker frenzy, maybe a very close second. And so maybe much as the common conception of the dancing epidemics is influenced by the hypothesis that, they were just high, like they just got super high and they danced for 6 months until they died. Like, yeah, we all know somebody who did that. The common conception of Dionysus is a little bit obscured by the conflation with Bacchus and the Bacchanalia in Rome. Which is very much like the gentrified version of Dionysus and the Dionysica. And I really don't mean that in just like a quippy kind of way. I mean, it's like the punk rock on MTV version of the Dionysica. Like, there are always scenarios where there is a cultural process, a movement, whatever, that is legitimately threatening to the existing social order, and B, demands of its participants like some kind of real commitment, like a willingness to transgress one's own boundaries and to experience extremes. And then those things inevitably get really assimilated by the social order that they initially existed in opposition to, and the parts that are like pleasing or merely aesthetic or whatever are all that remain. Like, there's that famous, oh God, I really don't remember. It might have been Bunel. It might have been some famous surrealist talking about how in the early days of surrealism, he says like, there's this common misconception that it was like a bunch of fun. And people just really don't understand. Like, it wasn't fun. It was like this deadly serious opposition to the social order. And then it got institutionalized as just sort of like art, like some more weird shit to look at that you go to like a commercial gallery to experience. And, or I don't know. I mean, there's just truly infinite instances of this. If you read The Situationists, you can see how a lot of what they considered to be like a revolutionary theory really just kind of ended up getting is really the version of consumer civilization that we live in now. I'm an old enough punk rocker to like, I'm like, yeah, like the reason that I had like an orange mohawk or whatever was because it enraged and terrified people and made them want to fight me. And now, of course, like everywhere I go, it's like, hey, look, it's just consumer society, except we all have blue hair and septum piercings, like these things just get assimilated. And the Bacchanalia is the like civilized assimilation of the Dionysica, which was not fucking civilized at all. So did people drink and fuck for Dionysus? Absolutely. But they also went mad. And, like the core characteristics of the process of being visited by Dionysus was like a sudden decisive rupture from normal life, an overwhelming state of like agitation, frenzy, like being consumed by a wild spirit that causes one to transgress all social boundaries, one's own boundaries. And so here to quote from Walter Otto's book, which was written in published in 1965 on Dionysus Myth and Cult, it's called. His appearance is startling, disquieting, violent. And like everything violent, it arouses opposition and agitation. Right at his birth, gods arise as his enemies. Terrible disturbances are engendered in his vicinity. The destruction of his mother is followed by suffering, bitter distress, and violent death for all who interest themselves in the little boy, beginning with his mother's sister Ino, who plunges into the sea out of her mind with her own child in her arms. And in this way, even the revelation of the God who has become a man creates wild emotion, anger, and opposition among mankind. The daughters of Minyas refuse to follow his call, and with good reason, for he rips the ones he has affected out of their wifely decency and morality and mates them with the mysteries and madnesses of the chaos of night. There's a long-standing tradition in this kind of scholarship to just like dive into the most poetic descriptions that you can come up with for this stuff. However, wish to remain true to their duties as housewives and attend their husbands until Dionysus incites them with the sharpest goad of his madness. Yeah, so it's like, it's got these same characteristics as the dancing epidemics or as Tarantism, where it's like, this involuntary, overwhelming compulsion to behave completely out of accord with social norms and to just go on kind of like a wild frenzy. And yeah, the relationship between the Dionysica and Tarantism, dancing epidemics of like particularly social transgression, that's like there's tons of continuity between all these three things. Quoting again from Otto, the god appeared with such wildness and demanded such unheard of things, so much that mocked all human order, that he first had to overpower the hearts of men before they could do him homage. Again, so it's involuntary. And then just one more quote emphasizing these kind of core themes. He who was born in this way is not only the exultant God, the God who brings man joy. He is the suffering and dying God, the God of tragic contrast. And the inner force of this dual reality is so great that he appears among men like a storm. He staggers them, and he tames their opposition with the whip of madness. All tradition, all order must be shattered. Life becomes suddenly an ecstasy of blessedness, but an ecstasy no less of terror. So, one can immediately call to mind the participants in Tarantism and the dancing epidemics who are simultaneously described as dancing ecstatically and of begging for, some kind of redemption that will allow them to no longer experience what they're experiencing. There's that pretty considerable duality there. So, and then in terms of the actual manifestations, in terms of what it specifically means to go wild and be consumed with the terror and the divine revelatory power of the mad deity and all this stuff, it looks a whole lot like these other phenomena we've discussed. There's some insane dancing and some just sort of like frenzied, a state of sort of like incessant, powerful hyper arousal, like a just sort of general state of agitation, ecstasy, frenzy, any and all of those things simultaneously in sequence, whatever. But yeah, a whole lot of like crazed dancing is definitely a central theme. Dionysus is particularly commonly invoked by or tends to possess women more, and so there's all these kind of like different variants of rituals about him coming into the world. Like his periodic appearances are often precipitated by some intentional ritual that women will do to bring him into existence, or by like a sort of involuntary possession episode. And when he is intentionally summoned, there's a number of historically attested sort of like frenzied dance rituals that are supposed to bring him into contact with the world. And in some of these rituals, he's also they're giving birth to him at the same time. Otto says, in wintertime on the heights of Parnassus, the choruses of the Delphic and Attic Thyiads employed an unusual method to call Dionysus to rise up, to appear among them and lead them madly over the mountaintop. They awakened him as Lycnides, as a child in the cradle. He had therefore just been born and had not yet gained consciousness. That occurred on the site where it was believed Dionysus danced and reveled with the nymphs. And when he opens his eyes, when he rouses himself, when he grows into glorious maturity, he will fill their hearts with a heavenly terror, their limbs with a maddening desire to dance, and he will go on before them, as the Orphic hymn, which we have mentioned before, says, as it speaks of his revel with the higher beings. And when you rouse anew the yearning for the triennial festival, you begin the song in the midst of your female attendants, the beauteously girt ones, who give voice to the shout of joy and excite the choruses to the dance. And then he says, but no matter when and where he may come from, whether he sails over the sea in a wondrous ship, or rises up from the depths of the sea, or as a newborn child suddenly opens his divine eyes, his passion takes possession of the women who awaited him, so that they throw their heads back, toss their hair, and rave, just as he himself is the one who raves. And so, if you're a fan of raves, I feel like most of the theoretical framework of raving has like largely, I like raves, but mostly I don't see like heavy theoretical baggage associated with it. But if you lived through the portion of the 90s, if you were in like the little corner of the 90s that I was in, you'd remember all of these kind of interrelated notions and all these like kind of different subcultural niches, like the temporary autonomous zone, right? Hakim Bey, modern primitive to some extent, the reclaim the street scene, a whole bunch of other sort of interrelated, I would crash worship as a phenomenon to some extent. But, like this general notion was very much in vogue and had a bunch of different manifestations in different subcultures of creating these kind of like spontaneous moments of really joyous rupture, and that being the socio-political strategy, right? That was like the resistance paradigm for a number of people. And so I love that in addition to reading about all the possibilities of the information superhighway / the World Wide Web, we spent our time reading about how raves were like a recapitulation of all the most important kind kind of like inherited psychological, spiritual, experiential tendencies that humanity had, and how we were going to use raves to destroy civilization, and it turns out that we were inhabiting the Dionysic paradigm. You know, we were just raving like Dionysus has been since the Bronze Age or whatever. And then just bear with me for one more of these. I find them so lovely. I've probably made my point, but these Walter Otto quotes just really, really do it for me. So maybe two more, something like that. So as one would perhaps expect of, you know, frenzied, uncontrollable dancing, it's very much associated with like insane, cacophonous, like a roaring din of music. Bellowing, shrill-sounding instruments accompany him. We often see them pictured in sculpture. A series of mythic stories and descriptions make us keenly aware of the overpowering spirit of the Dionysic din, which makes its violent entry as it captivates and inspires dread at one and the same time. To the astonishment of the inhabitants of India, the troops of the militant Dionysus also advanced to the sound of flutes, drums, pipes, and crashing cymbals. And then again to talk about how we're obviously in the presence when we talk about the Dionysic rituals and the states that people enter in relation to Dionysus. You know, we're clearly talking about something that is very broadly distributed in the human population, but then it's always highly culturally patterned. And so there's some like very, very specific aspects of Dionysic madness that you're not going to find in other forms of ritual madness or mass psychogenic illness or whatever you want to call it. So, you know, like the women who are possessed by Dionysus, as they like run like wild beasts over the land and dance in a frenzy, they're often depicted holding animals, like holding like bear cubs and leopard cubs and things like that. And they are alternately nursing these young wild animals or tearing them to pieces. Right, so that's some like very specific kind of like a little Dionysic specific variant on this general phenomenon of spirit possession, ecstatic frenzy state. These women who are intoxicated by the presence of Dionysus are sometimes called maenads, and they characteristically wield these kind of like staffs with ivy foliage on them, called a thyrsus. I think that's how it's pronounced. So here is really actually my last Walter Otto quote. But to just give some sense of like the very specific forms of Dionysic madness. They strike rocks with the thyrsus, and water gushes forth. They lower the thyrsus to the earth, and a spring of wine bubbles up. If they want milk, they scratch up the ground with their fingers and draw up the milky fluid. Honey trickles down from the thyrsus made of the wood of the ivy. They gird themselves with snakes and give suck to fawns and wolf cubs as if they were infants at the breast. Fire does not burn them. No weapon of iron can wound them, and the snakes harmlessly lick up the sweat from their heated cheeks. Fierce bulls fall to the ground, victims to numberless tearing female hands. And sturdy trees are torn up by the roots with their combined efforts. So you see what I mean. Like, there's the Roman version where it's like, let's get drunk and fuck. And then there's the original version that's like, let's run shrieking with madness over the land, tearing bulls apart with our bare hands and suckling wolf cubs, right? Another thing that's striking about that final description I read, fire doesn't burn them, weapons of iron won't wound them, is that this is like some like pretty specifically similar language to how berserkers are described in Viking culture, like more than a millennia later.
Strike and strike and strike
A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts.
Yes, Father!
So again, it seems like we are definitively in the presence of some pretty general human psychological behavioral phenomenon. Here's what an article in The Psychologist said about the dancing epidemics in particular. An important clue to the cause of these bizarre outbreaks lies in the fact that they appear to have involved dissociative trance, a condition involving, among other things, a dramatic loss of self-control. It is hard to imagine people dancing for several days, with bruised and bloodied feet, except in an altered state of consciousness. But we also have eyewitness evidence that they were not fully conscious. Onlookers spoke of the dancing maniacs of 1374 as wild, frenzied, and seeing visions. One noted that while they danced, their minds were no longer clear, and another spoke of how, having wearied themselves through dancing and jumping, they went, quote, raging like beasts over the land. And so, this article makes the somewhat potentially kind of obvious point that there seems to be, a sort of a truly innate factor here, a general sort of psychological phenomenon that is universal, but also that if there's a cultural framework that describes a possession state as possible, that's when people are going to experience these particular kinds of manifestations of this potentially much more general phenomenon where, they go into the wild frenzy and they're intoxicated by the presence of some deity, or they're begging priests and monks to exorcise the devil from them or whatever. So the article says, studies of possession cults in hundreds of modern cultures from Haiti to the Arctic reveal that people are more likely to experience dissociative trance if they already believe in the possibility of spirit possession. Minds can be prepared by learning or passive exposure to shift into altered states. But so here is where, once again, these exceptionally amorphous boundaries between different phenomena that kind of live in different scientific disciplines and are analyzed often in fairly separate terms, but one can see that despite the incommensurate terms, often people are talking about something with some very clear continuities or similarities. So we really descend into scientific chaos when we start talking about the so-called culture-bound syndromes in general. And this is this really asks some deep questions. I mean, the phrase initially came into being to describe, because anthropologists and other people would encounter these really unique forms of madness in different cultures that they visited. And so, the first analytical framework was kind of there's some, there's some forms of mental illness that require some sort of cultural attenuation, or some sort of cultural framework to come into existence. How interesting, another fascinating variation on the human experience. But then ultimately, there's so many of them, and the question immediately becomes, if one really gives it a moment of thought, is not every form of madness essentially a culture-bound syndrome? In other words, the assumption in a lot of that early analysis is that for whatever reason, the forms of psychosis and, madness, depression, whatever, that we encounter here in our obviously completely healthy, psychosocially integrated society are somehow default forms of madness. They're the ones that aren't somehow culturally attenuated at all. And, not really any particular evidence for that assumption. It's just an assumption. And so that, so that brings up a lot of core questions about fundamental assumptions to be found in Western psychiatry. So to quote from a book called The Handbook of Multicultural Mental Health, Culture-bound syndromes are generally limited to specific societies or culture areas and are localized folk diagnostic categories that frame coherent meanings for certain repetitive, patterned, and troubling sets of experiences and observations. There is seldom a one-to-one equivalence of any culture-bound syndrome with a DSM diagnostic entity, the DSM being the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the so-called Bible of psychiatric disorders here in Western civilization. So they further say, culture-bound syndromes represent a major area of concern and debate in the study of culture and mental health because their existence calls into question the very foundations on which so much Western psychiatry is based. Marcella, 2000, noted that there are many questions being debated regarding culture-bound syndromes. A fundamental question central to these debates asks, if culture-bound syndromes are limited to specific societies or culture areas, who defines the criteria for mental illness? Marcella and Yamada, 2010, further pose, why is it that the non-Western disorders are contextualized in non-Western cultures, but those identified and coded in the West in DSMs and ICDs are the real thing? Certainly, they are as much cultural products as those from non-Western cultures. And then they ask some questions. Should culture-bound syndromes be considered neurotic, psychotic, or personality disorders? Should these syndromes be considered variants of disorders considered to be universal by many Western scientists and professionals? For instance, is susto, or soul loss, merely a variant of depression? And 3, are all disorders culture-bound, since none can escape cultural encoding, shaping, and presentation? Are they indeed? So culture-bound syndromes are kind of fun. I mean, they're just like, it's such a wide range of exceptionally idiosyncratic behaviors, complexes of behaviors. It's a great window into the truly fabulous variation that humanity is capable of. To give you kind of some sample fairly at random, here's from a paper on a phenomenon called LATA. LATA is typically classified as an exotic culture-specific psychiatric syndrome involving exaggerated responses to startle, and is almost exclusively confined to Malayo-Indonesian cultures. In mild episodes, persons typically exhibit involuntary utterances of incomprehensible, meaningless, or obscene words and or gesturing, which persist for no more than a few seconds. Severe episodes typically last from a few minutes to several hours and are characterized by verbal obscenities and mimicking others' actions or words. Persons with severe cases reportedly experience automatic obedience and partial or complete amnesia, and they are not held accountable for their actions. The overwhelming majority of cases involve females. And in this paper on LATA has its own variant of a very familiar ideological debate about cultural specificity and the extent to which we can make any kind of universal statements about humanity, or whether we should think of every culture as a mutually incomprehensible, totally self-contained system. So, this author of this paper, the theoretical point he's making in writing it is to argue against the notion that LATA represents a culturally patterned, specific instance of the startle response is what he focuses on. He says claims that LATA is a local variant of a universal startle disorder that is shaped by cultural conditioning are criticized. It is concluded that LATA is a uniquely Malayo-Indonesian idiom. And that this is the same thing as when anthropologists see a bunch of people getting married in different societies and they have different conceptions, or they're able to apply a little bit of literary finesse to make it seem like they have radically different conceptions of what marriage is. And so they're so as you can see, none of these practices have anything to do with one another. failing to kind of grasp. It's like the fish not noticing the water in which it swims, failing to grasp that the very notion of marriage is in fact, kind of like a coherent concept applied to all these different cultures. And likewise, I mean, like maybe the startle response per se is a little too specific of a frame, but we can certainly say that there's such a thing as going crazy, if not in every culture, in a huge array of them, and that, there's such a thing as going crazy in a way where you deviate from social conventions in these really conspicuous ways, and that's like a very broadly distributed phenomenon, and that when that happens, it happens in such a way that people take tons of cues from their cultural setting. And so, like, I mean, that's kind of the irony. And like, that doesn't say nothing about human biology, right? And about universal human experience. And like, the very fact that like, people always think biology means invariance, but it doesn't. And like, the very fact that people are able to take these richly structured sets of cues from their culture and apply them to their own process of going insane is really like powerful. That's like by no means a default state of affairs. One can easily imagine a hypothetical world in which people go crazy, and it is actually just like a truly universal thing, and there's no cultural patterning of it whatsoever. And that would also indicate biology. You can't really like talk too much about organisms without getting into a little biology, and that's what we are. But it would be a different kind of biology. So this indicates some really interesting and rather specific mechanisms for how we experience states of social deviation and madness, and in particular that we take tons of cues on how to manifest them. So another author of a 1995 paper with the charmingly unassuming title Culture-Bound Syndromes, published in a journal called Cultural Psychiatry, doesn't take such a militantly particularistic, kind of like classic social constructivist anthropological approach. And so these authors do talk about some of the universal or broadly distributed aspects of what we call culture-bound syndromes. And the first one that they focus on, probably like the most fundamental category, is disassociation. So they say of dissociative phenomena, in a remarkable number of culture-bound syndromes, the predominant symptom is disassociation. One might hypothesize that disassociation is more common, more recognized, or more accepted in other cultures. Alternatively, culture affects the form of dissociative symptoms more than it is able to affect any other emotional phenomena. As individuals are highly suggestible during dissociative states, a psychopathologic entity characterized or created by disassociation would be particularly plastic and susceptible to unique molding by the culture in which it is found. And then they quote some other authors. Nowhere should cultural influences on symptomatology be more noticeable than among the dissociative disorders, which can be understood as extreme and dramatic responses to behavior or socially induced trauma. Thus, the content of dissociative symptoms, and to some extent the process of dissociative disorders, reflect the diversity of cultures, although the mental mechanisms underlying these symptoms may be presumed to be universal. And then they give some examples of culture-bound syndromes that have been described as dissociative phenomena. Amok, which is a Malaysian term used to describe a syndrome characterized by homicidal frenzy, but it's preceded by a phase of like brooding, and it's followed by amnesia. A lot of really specific characteristics. And so, like in the DSM, it's just listed as a dissociative state, but its most kind of noteworthy aspect is mass assault, right? So, it's like running amok and killing people. And then there's a bunch of syndromes that have been described as like amok-like, Cathard in Polynesia, Sudanite in the Sahara, and on and on. There's quite a few of them. Everywhere from Kenya to polar Eskimos to Canada, New Guinea, some version of this sort of like mass homicidal frenzy state is found. They talk about a phenomenon called falling out or blacking out, which I've never heard of. I did a little bit of time in the South, but apparently this is found in the southern United States and in the Caribbean, and it's characterized by a sudden collapse. The eyes remain open, but the person afflicted by it says that they can't see, and they often feel like essentially paralyzed. And then there's Pibloktok, which is found in Arctic and subarctic Eskimos, and it's characterized by an abrupt episode of extreme excitement, common theme that we keep encountering, followed by like seizures and like a coma-like state. And in Pibloktok, which is also called Arctic hysteria, the person who's subject to it may be like really withdrawn or irritable prior to the performance of prior to the emergence of this extremely excited state where they commit irrational, dangerous acts and which they don't remember afterwards. There's a grissy sickness, which is something found on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua and Honduras among the Miskito people, and it affects mostly young women who believe they're being attacked or raped by devils, and who run through the villages or into the bush or whatever. Running is the most distinctive feature of the syndrome, but they may also engage in acts of like aggression or, just sort of like impulsive, wild behavior, frenzied behavior. It's been likened to Pibloktok or Arctic hysteria. And some scientists have put it into have tried to create these classificatory schema where they're like, these are like the running syndromes. It's part of the running taxa. So there's just like a ton of these. We could do an hour, or we could do a few hours of just like going through culture-bound syndromes and describing some of their symptoms. The last one I want to mention, just because it's so highly specific, such a culturally unique phenomenon, is called kayak angst, and it's an Inuit Eskimo term that refers to intense fear of capsizing and drowning when you're going out into the open ocean in a kayak. And so, it has all these like really specific symptoms. There's that's like a very specific kind of panic attack with like unique manifestations of disorientation or whatever. So, kayak angst. I liked that a lot. I thought that was like a very good example of, like I said, the really just like fabulous variation that our species is capable of, and just like the sort of like very unique, idiosyncratic, like niche manifestations of madness and affliction that we can find. Now, of course, some states of frenzied madness or possession or, unbearable ecstasy or whatever are arguably a little more convincing than others. And here's an example of one that I find more or less thoroughly unconvincing.
Strike and 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 strike until you have victory. For every enemy that is aligned against you, let there be that we would strike the ground, for you will give us victory, God. I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of shouting and singing. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of an abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of an abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. The Lord Lord says it is done. The Lord says it is done. The Lord says it is done. For I hear victory, 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 victory in the corridors of heaven. In the corridors of heaven, victory, 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 victory. For angels are being released right now. Angels are being dispatched right now. Amanda ata ata raka teda baka sanda ata ambo osa kata rite eke banda ata rite didi asata. For angels have even been dispatched from Africa right now. Africa right now. Africa right now. From Africa right now. They're coming here. They're coming here. In the name of Jesus. From South America. They're coming here. They're coming here. They're coming here. They're coming here. From Africa. From South America. Angelic forces. Angelic reinforcement. Angelic reinforcement. Angelic reinforcement. Pika hata anda ata. Ora bata rata ande eke eke manda rasata. For I hear the sound of victory. 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 I hear the sound of victory.
I consider myself something of like a connoisseur of shitty performance art. I've spent a lot of my life doing performances, yeah, and I've seen a lot of like terrible performances, but like this is really like sort of unusually bad, I think, and this is Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, apparently. I can't remember her name, and this happened, I think, like the day of the election or somewhere thereabouts. But so, so let's get into some of the like generalizable aspects. We talked about disassociation, but what else are we talking about? What are some like consistent themes with all of these various phenomena? And I think that the reason that this lady is so unconvincing is because she just hasn't suffered enough. And that's definitely a very consistent aspect in a lot of the phenomena that we've discussed so far. Is like a response, like what's happening is a response to some unbearable situation or another. Quoting from a paper on the dancing epidemics in particular, the years preceding the dancing epidemics were exceptional in their harshness. The 1374 outbreak maps onto the areas most severely affected, earlier in the same year, by one of the worst floods of the century. Chronicles tell of the waters of the Rhine rising 34 feet, of floodwaters pouring over town walls, of homes and marketplaces submerged, and of decomposing horses bobbing along watery streets. In the decade before the dancing plague of 1518, famine, sickness, and terrible cold caused widespread despair in Strasbourg and its environs. Bread prices reached their highest levels for a generation. Thousands of starving farmers and vine growers arrived at the city gates, and old killers like leprosy and the plague were joined by a terrifying new affliction named syphilis. So yeah, a lot of scholarship on possession states cross-culturally, whether people are talking about Haiti or Africa or wherever, describe like really harsh conditions as a frequent precursor to mass episodes, in particular of dissociative states, and whatever we want to call this complex of syndromes and manifestations of some clearly underlying unitary phenomenon. An example, so there was a sort of after the dancing epidemics, there was a series of epidemics of like dissociative states and possession episodes in nunneries in Europe, and it's largely thought that was just because of the exceptional harshness of the conditions, like the absurdly rigorous conditions that nuns were subject to in that time. So there's descriptions of, for instance, in the mid 1700s, a nunnery experiencing an epidemic of screaming, squirming, and trance. And then naturally, anytime you get an epidemic of screaming, squirming, and trance, you're going to want to behead a suspected witch. So they did that, and then there was a decline. This stopped happening in populations at large in Europe. But it did tend to continue in settings where things were like particularly harsh. And I guess it seems to me like harshness per se might not even be a sufficient condition, but strict, where people were in like, I would say like more constraints on behavior than we're evolutionarily prepared for, or constraints of a variety that we're not evolutionarily prepared for. So quoting again from the Lancet, the incidence of possession declined with the rise of modern rationalism. Thereafter, mass outbreaks of disassociation tended to be confined to harshly managed settings, such as factories and schools, and to be triggered by groundless fears of poisoning or exposure to toxic chemicals. So that sort of became one of the primary themes, is instead of spider bites, instead of demonic possession, in a number of like Western settings, in various like schools and, like they said, like harshly managed settings, people experienced sort of like mass disassociation because of like some kind of suspected poisoning or another. Which, you can see the pretty clear continuity between Tarantism and that. And so here we can see, for all the debates, when phenomena like this emerge in a variety of cultures, there's some sort of like traditional framework that it clearly manifests. But then as we get into more and more modern settings, that really vanishes, but there is definitely still some version of the same phenomenon occurring. So overviews of mass psychogenic illness will, typically get through like dancing epidemics and super like aesthetically spectacular things like that. And then eventually you're in a Louisiana high school in like the 40s, right? And it's like, there's some researchers investigating an epidemic of spasmodic twitching in a high school among girls, and we can see some of those, like the basic like stress responses. I think this is where, if you listen to the elephants episode, we can talk about how trauma is induced both by like situations that there's sort of like a consensus are exceptionally harsh, but also by a number of settings and experiences where some crucial evolutionary psychological need is not being met or is being actively like thwarted in some way, where, we wouldn't necessarily identify an element of like overt, like brutality per se. And so, I think that a setting like this, like a Louisiana high school, is a case in which that's probably true. Probably not everybody was experiencing, probably some people were, like abuse is fucking rampant every goddamn where, but probably some of these girls weren't experiencing like truly horrible, say like physical abuse or anything, but probably all of them were experiencing some degree of like horrible alienation and, dysphoria and like the terrors of the modern world in some version or another. But yeah, so this is again where the boundaries get fuzzy, and a lot of these discussions get like a little bit amorphous, because now if we're in the Louisiana high school, we're definitely not in the realm of like some traditional religious phenomena being manifested over and over again. Like whether or not stress or like profound adversity is a factor. It's like this is clearly not happening when people are complaining of being like poisoned by imaginary industrial chemicals. It's not, that's not a manifestation of some ancient tradition. And so, Mass psychogenic illness, also called mass anxiety hysteria or mass motor hysteria, is simply defined as the collective occurrence of physical symptoms and related beliefs among two or more persons in the absence of an identifiable pathogen. So that's, not a particularly overtly religious definition, even though religious frameworks clearly play a huge role in how this phenomenon manifests, and it's a list of symptoms that have been associated with mass psychogenic illness or mass anxiety hysteria or mass motor hysteria reads: dizziness, fainting, abdominal pain, nausea, chills, numbness, twitching, malaise, trismus, crying, screaming, involuntary shaking, paralysis, depression, hyperventilation, itching and rash, burning eyes, sore throat, running, laughing, jumping, insomnia, trance states, puggescent states, hallucinations, headache, vomiting, blindness, diarrhea, echolalia, foul mouth taste, choking, globus, coughing, hiccup, nose bleeding, muscle weakness, sleepiness, chest discomfort, tinnitus, shivering, catalepsy, memory loss, fever, digestive disorders, and yawning. Right, so a profound diversity of manifestations that can be collectively experienced, and that is just so fucking interesting to me. And so, these debates rage, should we talk about this in psychological terms? Should we talk about this in cultural terms? If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you probably will not be surprised to hear me say, I don't see how this is a legitimate binary at all. So characteristic excerpt from an academic discussion about this. The term mass psychogenic illness is frequently used interchangeably with mass or epidemic hysteria. Stahl, 1982, prefers the term mass sociogenic illness, since most cases have as much group or peer input as they have psychological explanations. Is it the result of psychology, or is it the result of interactions with groups and cultural processes? Again, I don't understand why, even if you're acknowledging both these factors, why these things are ostensibly in any sort of opposition, or how one could exist without the other. So to give a further example from Bartholomew's paper on tarantism, episodes of dancing mania and tarantism in Europe during the Middle Ages are typically regarded as forms of mass psychogenic illness, as is collective demon possession. Actually, as tarantism is regarded as a variation of dancing mania, and since victims of this latter ailment were often considered to have been possessed by demons, all three categories overlap and share similar symptomatologies. The determination that these episodes should be placed under the mass psychogenic illness rubric is based upon descriptive, retrospective judgments of primarily anecdotal evidence for which it is now not possible to determine the presence of an environmental, viral, or bacteriological agent. And then, so he goes through some admittedly pretty ridiculous hypotheses about where tarantism comes from, including inbreeding and, some other real absurdities. And, I don't know, it kind of feels like liberal bullshit to me. I hate people who just can't endure other people's madness and behavioral, social deviations or whatever. And, so he's going through all of these ridiculous medical theories, that are admittedly sort of shockingly condescending to the participants in these phenomena. But then he's kind of doing the thing, he's as is so characteristic of so much kind of anthropological, Western anthropological stuff that critiques, Western perspectives on other cultures or whatever, where he's kind of doing this liberal thing. It's pretty analogous to when liberals are the protests were totally nonviolent, where they're scolding other people for characterizing some behavior as deviant or dangerous, but in the process they're just kind of not, they're ultimately just totally acquiescing to the notion that the deviance or the dangerousness is a bad thing per se. And so, he's kind of he's kind of like trying to tell us that these people didn't really go totally insane and didn't, and I just think that, I think that the obvious other perspective to have would be that, like, maybe these people experienced divine madness, and maybe that's just okay. So he says, by focusing on bizarre in quotation marks, and I'm a little like, it's okay to be bizarre. Like, maybe Tarantism is a little fucking weird, right? Maybe that's just okay. Maybe people are just not as, like, rational and constrained in their behavior as you and all of these, like, Western, like Western supremacists, like, cultural illiterates that you're critiquing in their medical assessments, like, as much as you and them both seem to think people should be. So yeah, by focusing on bizarre, quote, descriptive aspects of Tarantism per se, and blinded by Western culture-biased definitions of normality, researchers have overlooked its symbolic significance in the influence of existing social and cultural norms. So that's characteristic of some of the academic discourse around all of these phenomena. And then just to give you one more example from Walter Otto's Dionysus Myth and Cult, where he likewise criticizes, I guess like a psychological explanation per se, talking about some other scholar named Rode. Even though Rhodes' artistry and perspicacity deserve great praise, today we must no longer be deceived by the fact that his conclusions were arrived at under the influence of the psychological presuppositions of his day. Every interpretation he made of religious phenomena had to start with human subjectivity. Now Rhodes has lost the relationship with the realities of the world in general. The only thing left was the world of the mind within us, with its own characteristic experiences, and thus the explanation he gave had to be completely psychological in nature, etc., etc. But so the point that I'm making is just broadly that there's like this sort of constant tension that people seem to invoke over and over again, even if like a lot of the scholarship acknowledges that that these factors all like contribute to one another, like to any fucking human behavioral phenomenon, and that there's really no way to even talk about things like psychology without talking about things like culture and vice versa. But you can see this tension nonetheless, where it's like, even if the binary is acknowledged to be kind of invalid, it's like people can't really seem to stop inhabiting it. And that to me is a powerful indication that somehow like the actual frame that people have selected is probably not the most suitable frame. And so what I think, I guess I've kind of already made this point, so this won't be like the startling reveal at the end of the podcast, but what I think is the appropriate frame, the sort of like the basic analytical framework that you can then look at all of these very, very diverse phenomena in, and they like in a way that achieves some analytical cohesion and some degree of coherence, is just like this idea of the general tendency toward a cohesion of behavior and belief in groups, in different like cultural aggregations, different aggregations of people, in the sense that like what's so interesting about this, and why I obviously think that this stuff is pretty intrinsically interesting. I've just like read a lot of the scholarship because I'm fascinated by it, but the reason that I selected it for the beginning of this series is because on some level it's so overtly arbitrary. Like if we talk about collective behaviors and it's like war or, like some like some kind of like really familiar institution, we're invoking a lot of like morality tales in the process or whatever. Like a lot of like extra baggage comes along for the ride. But so many of these behaviors are so markedly idiosyncratic. Like what they ultimately, like their ultimate characteristic is kind of like a degree of arbitrariness, like a degree to which they illustrate this basic reality that group membership implies cohesions of behavior, even if the behaviors themselves don't really have any clear sort of like inevitable innate imperative at all. That when groups of humans aggregate, cues can be given for very, very like non-default types of behavior, for behaviors that individuals would never necessarily conceive of on their own. I mean, again, even though we can see some unitary aspects of all of these different phenomena that we've described, the sort of like hyperarousal, the frenzy, the social deviation, the fairly frequent association with stress, all that good stuff. But then, you know, like when we're talking about something like kayak angst, or when we're talking about a specific type of divine madness that makes you either want to suckle or rend limb for limb a baby animal, you know, like we're clearly in this territory where it's obvious that group beliefs and group behaviors are actually free to vary over an incredibly wide range, and that people will nonetheless experience that incredible like diversity and idiosyncrasy of different like behaviors and beliefs when they're in those cultural groups as like a legitimate kind of like inevitability, or like a very obvious mode of expression and experience. And so that's the basic idea. I think in a previous podcast I quoted John Tooby talking about this in terms of belief, and I think in this episode we got more into behavior, even though the behaviors have some beliefs underlying them. But you know, he says exactly this, that belonging to a group is such a fundamental, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it's such a fundamental psychological imperative that it supersedes the beliefs or behaviors of the group per se in the case of most people, and therefore beliefs are free to vary spectacularly. Group beliefs are free to be very, very weird. And so you can probably see some like reasonably obvious socio-political implications in the world we live in today from this general psychological tendency. And so that's what we're going to get into. This series, this will be a 4-part series, and we're going to leave dancing epidemics and Dionysic frenzies behind and talk about other aspects of group psychology. But that's our starting point, is this idea that to some extent, while certainly many aspects of human behavior are recurrent between different groups, and you know, we can point out universals in human experience, and those you know obviously provide very important indications of what human behavioral biology is. But that groups also just exist on that. There's an evolved psychological mechanism for group membership and group cohesion that is so powerful that it also allows for all this wild variation in group behavior and belief. And then, so in future episodes of this series, we will talk about other dynamics of group psychology and probably like much more explicitly connect them with socio-political realities that we currently experience. The next episode we'll talk about this phenomenon in other species a little bit. We'll dive into some like, I guess what I would call like proper evolutionary theory. You know, as much as this podcast is always about how evolution affects behavior and perception, we're gonna do some real proper evolutionary theory. We're gonna talk about like competition between genes and all the stuff that evolutionary theorists, I'm going to kind of critique what I guess I would characterize as a majoritarian tendency or like a mainstream of evolutionary theory. This is where This is where, after telling y'all that we need to understand this stuff to understand human behavior for a long time, I will turn on my source material and talk about some of its considerable flaws. And then in the next one that we do, we'll get into the dark side of group psychology. We'll go there. And then there'll be a final one where we will discuss what hope lies in the evolved psychology of group participation and collective beliefs and behaviors, because I think that group psychology both contains the seeds of the darkest and most destructive and stupid and terrible aspects of human behavior, as well as the most beautiful and redemptive and, worthwhile aspects of human behavior. So until that time, check out that Patreon if you're feeling it. Find me on social media or whatever. Tell all your friends about how much you adore this podcast. And my appeal for people to write to me has been working, and it's been just tremendously gratifying. It really does keep me going to see that engaged, interesting people are listening and getting something out of this. And I really do welcome critiques, and I really welcome communication of all varieties. So you can find my email at againsttheinternet.com. Talk again soon, friends.
A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts. A religious frenzy erupts.